Chapter 3. The Cardinal Difficulty of Naturalism. We cannot have it both ways, and no sneers at the limitations of logic. Amend the dilemma. It's a quote from I.A. Richards from a book called Principles of Literary Criticism, Chapter 25. If naturalism is true, every finite thing or event must be, in principle, explicable in terms of the total system. I say explicable in principle because, of course, we are not going to demand that naturalists at any given moment should have found the detailed explanation of every phenomenon. Obviously, many things will only be explained when the sciences have made further progress. But if naturalism is to be accepted, we have a right to demand that every single thing should be such that we see in general how it could be explained in terms of the total system. If any one thing exists which is of such a kind that we see in advance the impossibility of ever giving it that kind of explanation, then naturalism would be in ruins. So what he's saying here is that for naturalism to be true, for it to be a self-contained system that allows nothing in and subsists on its own, for that to be true, every event, every phenomenon that takes place inside the system, everything from the formation of a star to the formation of a virus, all of those things have to be explained in terms of the system. We can't have anything extra involved. The system has to explain, all the events in the system have to be explained by the system. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So no additional explanations. Just each event has to be, we have to be able to show why we have to be able to show why each event could occur within within the rules that the system has in place. This, if you watch the X-Files, this would be like the Scully explanation, right? Anytime Mulder on the X-Files would run into some crazy phenomenon, something that looked like magic, or something that looked like something that looked divine, or even alien, even though that would actually fall into C.S. Lewis's demand here. It was Scully's job on the show to sort of be the rational mind, and say, well, there's a rational explanation for this. There's a scientific explanation for this. In other words, there's a natural explanation for whatever was happening in the show. Now, invariably, she was wrong and he was right. Sometimes she wasn't, but usually he was right and she was wrong. She just couldn't admit it. But that's what we're asking for here. If naturalism is to be so, we want the Scully explanation. What's the rational explanation? Nothing extra. He continues, if necessities of thought force us to allow to any one thing any degree of independence from the total system, that would be like the Mulder explanation, something extra. If any one thing makes good a claim to be on its own, to be something more than an expression of the character of nature as a whole, then we have abandoned naturalism. For by naturalism we mean the doctrine that only nature, the whole interlocked system, exists. And if that were true, everything and event would, if we knew enough, be explicable without remainder, no heel taps, as a necessary product of the system. The whole system being what it is, it ought to be a contradiction in terms if you were not reading this book at the moment. And conversely, the only cause why you are reading it ought to be that the whole system, at such and such a place and hour, was bound to take that course. So he's earlier he said that he said I say that everything should be explicable in principle, in terms of the total system. And he says obviously we can't expect the naturalist to be able to explain everything we see. sometime eventually, some things will eventually be explained as explicable by the naturalists when science has made enough advances. There are some things that aren't explicable right now, but we have to see that in principle they could be explained by the system, right? That whatever thing we're looking at, whatever phenomenon we're observing, we could see in principle that that could be explained by the system, in terms of the system. We could get the Scully explanation from that or for that event. You can see where we're going here at the end of this paragraph, where he says the whole system being what it is, it ought to be a contradiction in terms if you were not reading this book at the moment. And conversely, the only cause why you are reading it ought to be that the whole system at such and such a place and hour was bound to take that course. This is really the crux of naturalism. It's why this chapter is called The Cardinal Difficulty of Naturalism. Cardinal meaning superior or first. For naturalism to be true, everything in the system depends on everything else. And certainly, and more importantly, it depends on what comes before it. Now, most things definitely fall into this category. For instance, you are dependent on the fact that your parents had a fruitful union years ago. So am I, and so is every human being, and so is every living thing that it's dependent on its ancestors. All events are in some sense dependent on events that came before. What we're talking about here is a process of cause and effect. With naturalism, and Lewis is about to go into this, this is the biggest problem. Because what you end up with, if that's universally true, no heel taps, as he says, no remainders, nothing left over, what you end up with, if that's universally true, is what philosophers call determinism. Now, determinism means if our universe, our system of nature is governed by determinism, it means that everything we are doing, we will do, we have done, was bound to occur. We had no free will in the matter. We had no choice in all of these things. This is why he says it ought to be a contradiction in terms if you weren't sitting here reading this book right now at this moment. The universe was bound to play out this way, like a record on a turnstile. The grooves are set not because the universe is thinking or because it's planning, but because the whole interlocked series of events that led up to this were bound to take this course.
You're saying I'm just one more domino.
One more domino, exactly.
Are you saying that naturalism and determinism are the same thing?
They are the same thing, right. If naturalism is going to be ironclad, if nothing else is going to be let in, as he said in this paragraph, no heel taps, no remainders, then determinism is inevitable. That's kind of redundant, but determinism is inevitable. All of our experiences, they may have felt like we had choice in the matter. They may have felt like we had some sort of agency, but that is merely a feeling, and all of the things we've ever done, all of the things we've said, all of the thoughts we've thought were unique or somehow owing to our own intuition and reason, all of those things were, as you said, one more domino. There's a series of dominoes, a very, very long series of dominoes that have fallen, and each one of those things, along with you as an individual, were one more of the dominoes. That's the principal difficulty that with naturalism he wants to highlight here. So let's go ahead and read the next paragraph. One threat against strict naturalism has recently been launched, on which I myself will base no argument, but which it will be well to notice. Now, this is sort of a little jump off of the main argument that he wants to push in this chapter, and it's a little, it's a little, if you haven't had any kind of a scientific education, it's a little bit esoteric. It's a little bit strange, but we'll quickly go through it here. The older scientists believed that the smallest particles of matter moved according to strict laws. In other words, that the movements of each particle were interlocked with the total system of nature. Some modern scientists seem to think, if I understand them, that this is not so. They seem to think that the individual units of matter, it would be rash to call it any longer a particle, moves in an indeterminate or random fashion, moves, in fact, on its own or of its own accord. The regularity which we observe in the movements of the smallest visible bodies, the things we could see, is explained by the fact that each of these contains millions of units, and that the law of averages therefore levels out the idiosyncrasies of the individual unit's behavior. And I'm just going to go ahead and read through this real quickly and then try to summarize it. The movement of one unit is incalculable, just as the result of tossing a coin once is incalculable. The majority movement of billions of units can, however, be predicted, just as if you tossed a coin a billion times, you could predict nearly equal number of heads and tails. Now, it will be noticed that if this theory is true, we have really admitted something other than nature. If the movements of the individual units are events on their own, events which do not interlock with all other events, then these movements are not part of nature. It would be indeed too great a shock to our habits to describe them as supernatural. I think we should have to call them subnatural. But all our confidence that nature has no doors, and no reality outside herself for doors to open upon, would have disappeared. There is apparently something outside her, the subnatural. It is indeed from this subnatural that all events and all bodies are, as it were, fed into her. And clearly, if she thus has a back door opening on the subnatural, it is quite on the cards that she may also have a front door opening on the supernatural, and events might be fed into her at that door too. I have mentioned this theory because it puts in a fairly vivid light certain conceptions which we shall have to use later on, but I am not, for my own part, assuming its truth. Those who, like myself, have had a philosophical rather than a scientific education find it almost impossible to believe that the scientists really mean what they seem to be saying. I cannot help thinking they mean no more than that the movements of individual units are permanently incalculable to us. Not that they are in themselves random and lawless, and even if they mean the latter, a layman can hardly feel any certainty that some new scientific development may not tomorrow abolish this whole idea of a lawless subnature, for it is the glory of science to progress. I therefore turn willingly to other ground. So, just to summarize quickly here, naturalists in the past felt that embraced the idea of determinism. They embraced the idea that all events are interlocked completely with absolutely no doors, as he puts it, on nature. There's no way into nature from anything outside. Even if there were something outside, say a god, there would be no way in. And he says more modern scientists, of course he's writing this 60, 70 years ago, they're modern to him, they'd be a little bit older to us, but more modern scientists who study things like quantum physics and dealing with the science of things that are even smaller than the atom. There are a whole host of theories, some of them, as far as I understand, pretty close to substantiated, that the smallest particles, these subatomic particles, do move in a random fashion in a way that's not predictable at all. And if this is so, and Lewis has some doubts here that someday we might not discover that we can't calculate those movements now, but we might be able to in the future, that if this is so, then what we've really done is abandoned the idea that nature is a completely interlocked system, because there's something that's random inside of it. There's something that's incalculable inside of it. And it would be difficult for us to call that supernatural because, our definition for that term really doesn't allow for that type of, I don't know, sort of gritty idea of things being fed into nature from below the surface. That's why he kind of calls it subnatural, because these are particles that not only we can't see, but are even smaller than the atom. So, but if it were true that these things were random completely, that this would have admitted the possibility of randomness or events on their own being fed into nature from the back door, as he puts it. And if that's possible, if there is a back door into the universe, it's quite possible, or quite on the cards, as he says, that there could be a front door, right? Something more like what we would think of as supernatural. Now he's like, I haven't had a scientific education, not a purely scientific education. He calls himself a layman, sort of a simpleton when it comes to these things. But he says, I find it very hard to believe that scientists actually mean this, and what they mean is that it's these movements of subatomic particles are incalculable to us. They might be calculable if we knew more, and maybe some new scientific advancement or discovery in the future will make them calculable to us. And then, of course, this whole idea would fall apart. So he says, I'm just mentioning it because it sort of introduces us to the idea that there is a way in. There is a way into nature, and he says, I'm going to turn to other ground, though, because this isn't exactly the firm ground I'm trying to stand on in this chapter. I'm trying to just mention it because it's a possibility, first of all, but also it kind of introduces us to the idea that he advances in this chapter. It is clear that everything we know, continuing here with Lewis, it is clear that everything we know beyond our own immediate sensations is inferred from those sensations. I do not mean that we begin as children by regarding our sensations as evidence, and thence arguing consciously to the existence of space, matter, and other people. I mean that if, after we are old enough to understand the question, our confidence in the existence of anything else, say the solar system or the Spanish Armada, is challenged, our argument in defense of it will have to take the form of inferences from our immediate sensations. Put in its most general form, the inference would run, since I am presented with colors, sounds, shapes, pleasures, and pains, which I cannot perfectly predict or control, and since the more I investigate them, the more regular their behavior appears, therefore, there must exist something other than myself, and it must be systematic. Inside this very general inference, all sorts of special trains of inference lead us to more detailed conclusions. We infer evolution from fossils. We infer the existence of our own brains from what we find inside the skulls of other creatures like ourselves in the dissecting room. So this is our prison, if you will. This is our prison. We're locked into experiencing the world through our senses, and we don't have any choice in that matter. Every piece of information that we have comes through that gateway, the five senses that we're all familiar with. If our ideas about anything are challenged, we have to rely on that, and we have to he's talking here about making inferences based on those senses. Let's say that as he says, any of our confidences in the existence of anything is shaken. Say, like our confidence in the existence our confidence that that the sun exists, for example. We would have to rely on our senses to infer that it does, right? To reason our way to the fact that it does. If someone questions our existence of the solar system, we have to rely on our senses in order to establish that it does in fact exist, and that it does have this this kind of a makeup and is governed by these rules or behaves in this sort of way. These are this is our curse, if you want to look at it that way, is to be locked into or imprisoned by our senses. He says, put in its most general form, the inference would run, since I am presented with colors, sounds, shapes, pleasures, and pains, which I cannot perfectly predict or control, and since the more I investigate them, the more regular their behavior appears, therefore there must exist something other than myself, and it must be systematic. Now, this is one giant inference, right? It's a titanic inference, in fact, because we seem to be, through our senses, presented with a world that is not us. The things that we're experiencing, heat and cold, the sound of the heating system pumping air into this room, the light hitting your eyes from the light bulbs that we're using to read, my voice hitting your ear, all of these things are presenting you with the idea that there's a world that isn't you. You're one thing in a world. And that world, the more you study it, the more you become familiar with it, the more it seems systematic. In other words, the more it seems like there are rules that govern it, rules that you have to behave by, or that dictate how you should behave if you want to survive in it. And those rules seem to be consistent and universal. And so he makes this giant inference. He makes and that's what an inference is, right? We have this evidence we're presented with, and we make a conclusion based on that evidence. That's what he does there. He says, so I'll read it one more time. Since I am presented with colors, sounds, shapes, pleasures, and pains, which I cannot perfectly predict or control, and since the more I investigate them, the more regular their behavior appears, in other words, the more they seem to conform to laws, therefore, here's the inference, the therefore part. Therefore, or because of this, there must exist something other than myself, and it must be systematic. There's the inference. Okay, we have the evidence that we're presented with all these things, and we make the inference. And I'm spending time on this because this is a very substantial part of the argument that Lewis wants to make in this chapter, and this is probably the most important chapter in this book. And additionally, it's probably the most difficult chapter in this book for us to understand. So we'll go on to the next paragraph here. He says, all possible knowledge then depends on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty, which we express by words like must be, and therefore, and since, is a real perception of how things outside our minds really must be, well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our minds, and not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we have no knowledge. Then we can have no knowledge. Unless human, unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. Now, that's a fairly important statement there, because it calls into question what we're doing when we're reasoning, what we're doing when we're making inferences. We have to be able to rely on our ability to make inferences in order for any knowledge to be possible. We can't know anything if the structure of our minds, the way our minds work, is just how they happen to work, rather than them actually being an insight into reality. As we talked about in the previous chapters, our senses are fallible. They are capable of making mistakes, perceiving things incorrectly, misunderstanding the circumstances that they're in, or not misunderstanding, but misperceiving the circumstances they're in, and those things can lead to misunderstandings in our minds. But at some point, our ability to take in information and make an inference or a conclusion based on that information has to be something that is a genuine insight, has to be something that has a genuine understanding of, or has the possibility of being a genuine understanding of what is going on. Otherwise, no knowledge can be possible.
But if you're a naturalist, that can't be true, right?
Well, that's the claim he's going to make in this chapter. Exactly. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. Now, here it is. This is Lewis's argument for why naturalism cannot be possible. Any theory about the universe, like naturalism is the theory that is on the cards right now. Any theory that's proposed has to leave room for our reasoning to be valid. The possibility of our reasoning to be valid. Obviously, a lot of our reasoning is invalid. Most of it probably is invalid. We make the wrong conclusions based on the wrong evidence, based on our prejudices, based on our biases. We may even lie. These are all possible, but there has to be at least the possibility of us making genuine insights, of us arriving at conclusions that reach the truth, that touch the truth, whatever the truth being outside of ourselves, the reality, in other words. That has to be possible. So unless the theory of the universe we're talking about leaves open that possibility, it cannot be true. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. And if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound, a proof that there are no such thing as proofs, which is nonsense. This is again, this is where we're really into the meat of this argument right here, because if we're going to propose a theory of the universe that says every event has to be dependent on previous events in a way that's deterministic, in other words, in a way that those events were bound to happen, that there was no choice, let's say, no free will in the matter, then this invalidates our reasoning. Because what is our reasoning? Our reasoning is a claim that that's exactly what's going on. That reasoned event, that event at that moment when you were reasoning, we're reserving for that event a claim that it is independent of what's going on, that it has taken in evidence and reached a conclusion. If that's not possible, if we're proposing a theory of the universe where such things like that are not possible, then what we've done is invalidate the theory before it's even got started. In order for reasoning to be valid, independent events have to be possible, at least for the sake of that reasoning moment. At least for that moment. We have to be able to allow that something is not dependent or interlocked with everything that's come before it, right? Going back all the way to the Big Bang. We have to allow that something like that is possible. Otherwise, what we have is a proof that there are no such thing as proofs. If someone comes along and says, well, the entire universe is a deterministic event, everything in it is subject to cause and effect, and when they say everything, they really mean everything. We can put everything in all caps there. Everything in it is dependent, is subject to cause and effect. Nothing is independent of anything else. What they've really done is invalidate their own assertion. They've really invalidated their own theory. The theory is that everything is interlocked, everything is dependent. Well, wouldn't that include, dear sir, the claim that you're making right now? the claim that you're making that the universe itself is this system you've said it is.
Well, so simply put, you're saying that if everything is deterministic, why try to convince me of anything right now?
Well, essentially, yes. If everything is deterministic, then that would include the idea that's in this person's head about the universe being deterministic. If everything is determined, then then everything is. I mean, that sounds circular, but to say that everything is deterministic is to include yourself and everything going on between your ears. It's to include all the thoughts and things that you consider to be insights. To say that everything is deterministic is itself an insight. You reached that conclusion by an insight. But there are no insights. That's not a thing that's possible in a universe where everything is deterministic. This is what it's a theory. It's a proof that there are no proofs, as Lewis puts it. He goes on here to quote this man named Professor Haldane. He says, "Thus a strict materialism refutes itself for the reason given long ago by Professor Haldane." Materialism is another way to say naturalism. Okay. Haldane says, quote, "If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." End quote. But naturalism, even if it is not purely materialistic, seems to me to involve the same difficulty, though in a somewhat less obvious form. It discredits our processes of reasoning, or at least reduces their credit to such a humble level that it can no longer support naturalism itself. The easiest way of exhibiting this is to notice the two senses of the word because. We can say grandfather is ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. We can also say grandfather must be ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet, and we know he is an invariably early riser when he is well. In the first sentence, because indicates the relation of cause and effect. The eating made him ill. We'll read that sentence again. Grandfather is ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. The eating made him ill. That's cause and effect. The cause is the eating. The effect is he is ill. In the second sentence, it indicates the relation of what logicians call ground and consequent. The old man's late rising is not the cause of his disorder, but the reason why we believe him to be disordered. We'll read that sentence again. Grandfather must be ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet, and we know he is an invariably early riser when he is well. We don't know him to be ill. We believe him to be ill based on the evidence that we have before us. Grandpa isn't awake yet. He's usually an early riser when he's well. Why isn't he here? He must be ill. There's the inference, right? There's the ground-consequent relationship. Ground being the evidence we have of Grandpa, and the consequent being the conclusion we have to draw based on the evidence that we have of Grandpa. What we have here is theory, right? We have a theory about why Grandpa isn't awake yet. There is a similar difference between, quote, he cried out because it hurt him, that's cause and effect, and, quote, it must have hurt him because he cried out, ground and consequent. You see the difference there? We know in the first sentence why he cried out. He cried out because it hurt him. He stubbed his toe or cut his finger. In the second sentence, we are drawing a conclusion based on the evidence presented to us. It must have hurt him because he cried out. Big difference there. We are especially familiar with the ground and consequent because in mathematical reasoning, quote, A equals C because we have already proved they are both equal to B. That's ground consequent there. If A is equal to C, A is equal to C because they are both equal to B. And this is one of the most fundamental rules in mathematics. If two things are two things being equal to each other, two things are equal to each other because they are equal to something else, right? If A is the same thing as B and C is the same thing as B, well, then A and C are the same things, aren't they? The one, the cause and effect, the one indicates a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs. The other, a logical relation between beliefs or assertions. The one indicates a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs. The other, a logical relation between beliefs or assertions. In the one, cause and effect, we can use the domino example. This is a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs. The dominoes on the table, one's tipped over, the other one must fall. The one behind it must fall. That's a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs. The other kind of thing we're talking about here, the ground consequent, is a logical relation between beliefs or assertions. This must be true because, or X must be true because of Y. Now, a train of reasoning has no value as a means of finding truth unless each step in it is connected with what went before in the ground consequent relation. If our B does not follow logically from our A, we think in vain. If what we think at the end of our reasoning is to be true, the correct answer to the question, why do you think this, must begin with the ground consequent because. Now, you notice in those first two sentences about Grandpa that the word because was used in two different senses. In one sense, it was the cause and effect relationship. In the other sense, it was the ground consequent relationship. And what he's saying here is, in order for our thinking to be rational, in order for it to be true, the correct answer to the question, why do you think this, must begin with the ground consequent because, and not the cause and effect because. If I asked you why you thought a certain thing, it couldn't begin with the kind of because that said, because I'm a man. Well, or because I'm 5'8", or because I'm a certain age, or because I'm born in a certain country. If you think one of those, if you think anything merely because, there's that cause and effect because. If you think anything merely because of the way things are, and not because it's a genuine insight, people usually see that as discrediting your belief. In fact, he goes on to argue this, in fact, when you can get a sense of this because...
Well, what do you think? Dumb that down a bit for me.
Okay. You can get a sense of this whenever you're arguing about something, say politics or economics with somebody, or even football, right? You can get a sense of this because, let's say you're arguing, now I happen to know that you're a Chiefs fan, let's say that you're arguing with someone about who the best quarterback in the league is, okay? And you say, well, I think it's Patrick Mahomes. And someone says, well, you're just saying that because you're a Chiefs fan.
I'm a homer.
You're a homer, exactly. You're biased. You were going to think that anyways. You're not saying that objectively. You're not reaching this conclusion because the evidence that's been offered pushes you in that direction and causes you to draw that conclusion rationally. You're saying that merely because you're a Chiefs fan and for no other reason. Now, if that's true, if the person who's saying this about your claim that Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback is true, then it does discredit your belief. If you think that he's the best quarterback only because, or merely because you're a Chiefs fan, that does discredit your claim. And you know this. So what do? No. I don't think it's because he's a Chiefs fan. What do? You go on to list statistics, right? You go on to list his credentials. You go on to list his accomplishments, his achievements. Then you might even compare those to other quarterbacks. Maybe not just playing now, but in the past. So you know that this discredits you if that's true, and so you defend it. Say, no, 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 that's not the case. I think this because, and then you go on to list your evidence. Now, you rigorously defend yourself because you're aware that if you only think something because you were bound to, that it discredits your belief. You know this. This is exactly what the naturalist position must do, C.S. Lewis is claiming. This is what the naturalist position must do to all of our arguments. All of our arguments, all of our beliefs, all of our assertions and claims must be the product of that type of because, that type of cause and effect because. You only think this because the universe was bound to turn out this way. Now, in this case, it's a much bigger because, not just because you're a Chiefs fan, but because the universe is playing itself out like a record on a turnstile, like the dominoes that are falling in your example. The universe was bound to turn out this way. That's why you think the way you do. That's why you believe the way you do. That's why you see things the way you do.
It's a little insulting.
Well, yeah, it's insulting. That's why everybody who's accused of it in an argument automatically defends themselves. And later he goes on to list this. In fact, I think it's on the next page. He says, well, when someone says, well, you only think that because you're a man, or you only think that because you're a woman. Well, that's a very insulting thing to say. And people will, if they want to continue talking to somebody who's insulted them that way, will defend that, no, that's not why I think that X, Y, or Z. I don't think this merely because I'm from the United States. I don't think this merely because I'm a capitalist. I think this because, and then you'll go on to defend your position, right? You'll try to do it rationally instead of accepting the idea that your beliefs and assertions, well, would have happened regardless of the evidence.
Evidence.
Right. So it would have happened regardless of the evidence. Excuse me. So we'll read that sentence one more time and then we'll go on. And that's extremely important though, because we're talking about, can nature admit independent events? Can it allow something that isn't dependent on previous events? That's exactly what reason claims for itself. It claims that it can. It claims that even though the universe has played out this way thus far, I, in this moment here, have drawn a conclusion that is a true insight. And you may be wrong, but if any claims about the universe or reality are going to be even possibly be true, you might be wrong about something, but you have to have the possibility of being right. Right? If what we think at the end of our reasoning is to be true, the correct answer to the question, why do you think this, must begin with the ground consequent because. It can't be because I'm a Chiefs fan. It has to be because Patrick Mahomes is, in fact, the best quarterback in the NFL. And I think everyone with any sense would agree with that. On the other hand, every event in nature must be connected with previous events in the cause and effect relation. But our acts of thinking are events. Therefore, the true answer to why do you think this must begin with the cause and effect because. So, in order for our reasoning to be true, we have to begin our defense of why we think a certain thing with the ground consequent because. We want the evidence because. We want the rational because. But if nature is a completely interlocked system, and our thinking, our reasoning is just one more event in all that cacophony of noise that is nature.
Why isn't every sentence cause and effect sentence?
Right, exactly. Why isn't every answer to the question why do you think this a cause and effect because rather than a ground consequent because? All defense
possible to live that way?
No, well, not and it's not possible to live that way and maintain that your thinking is valid. Unless our conclusion is the logical consequent from a ground, it will be worthless and could be true only by a fluke, only by an accident. We could reach reality, we could touch reality, we could sum up reality only by by a mistake, a fluke, by stumbling upon being right, rather than actually drawing a reasonable conclusion. Unless it is the effect of a cause, it cannot occur at all in the naturalist system, because all things, unless they're the effect of a cause, can't occur at all. All things are interlocked. All things are tied to each other. So unless something is the effect of a cause, it cannot occur at all. It looks, therefore, Lewis says, as if in order for a train of thought to have any value, these two systems of connection must apply simultaneously to the same series of mental acts, ground consequent and cause and effect. But unfortunately, the two systems are wholly distinct, he continues. To be caused is not to be proved. Wishful thinkings, prejudices, and the delusions of madness are all caused, but they are ungrounded. Indeed, to be caused is so different from being proved that we behave in disputation as if they were mutually exclusive. The mere existence of causes for a belief is popularly treated as raising a presumption that it is groundless, and the most popular way of discrediting a person's opinions is to explain them causally. This is what we were talking about a moment ago. Quote, you say that because, there's the cause and effect because, you say that because you are a capitalist, or you say that because you are a hypochondriac, or you say that because you are a mere man, or only a woman. Now, when someone says that to you in an argument, immediately, your hackles rise. Okay, so let's read that one more time. The mere existence of causes for a belief is popularly treated as raising a presumption that it is groundless, and the most popular way of discrediting a person's opinions is to explain them causally. You say that because you are a capitalist, or a hypochondriac, or a mere man, or only a woman. The implication is that if causes fully account for a belief, then, since causes work inevitably, the belief would have had to arise whether it had grounds or not. We need not, it is felt, consider grounds for something which can be fully explained without them. And that's one of the reasons that someone will try to discredit you that way if they're lazy in their argument. They'll say you only think Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the NFL because you're a Chiefs fan. Well, that means they don't have to deal with the possibility that he is the best quarterback in the NFL. They don't have to deal with the evidence. They don't have to contend with the theory. Because if it can be easily explained, if your claim about him can be easily explained away, why deal any further with you? You can be brushed aside, right? It's easy to get rid of you. If you can just say, well, you only think that because you're a hypochondriac. You're not actually sick. You're just somebody who's bound to think they're always sick. Every sniffle, every tickle in the back of your throat, every abnormal feeling in your knee is evidence that you're about to die. Evidence that you're sick. You're just a hypochondriac. You're not actually sick. That way we don't have to examine your knee or have you take some vitamins or take you to the doctor, because we can just dismiss this claim that you have. But if you're actually sick, or maybe you are a determined hypochondriac, you'll go, no, that's not. You got to understand. Look at this. Look at this rash, or look at this discoloration, or listen to my knee click and when it bends. You might say something. Yeah. Right. Got to bring in George Costanza there. Yeah. It's a white discoloration. He says the implication is that if causes fully account for a belief, then since causes work inevitably, they were going to happen no matter what, the belief would have had to arise whether it had grounds or not. We need not, it is felt, consider grounds for something which can be fully explained without them. But even if grounds do exist, what exactly have they got to do with the actual occurrence of the belief as a psychological event? So there could be evidence for you being sick, or there could be evidence that Mahomes is the best quarterback in the NFL. But what have they got to do with the actual occurrence of the belief as a psychological event? If we're living in a naturalistic system, whether there was evidence or not, your beliefs were bound to occur, whether there was evidence or not for them. So even if there were evidence, it wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't help the naturalist argument, because the the belief that you're entertaining, the belief that you are claiming about the world, and that's what those are, a belief that you are sick or a belief that Mahomes is this quality of quarterback is a claim about the universe. It's a claim about the universe that's external to yourself, the universe that isn't you, right? You're making a claim about it. What if there were evidence for whatever claim you're making? It really wouldn't make a difference if naturalism is in fact true. You were bound to think that, whether there was evidence or not.
That's it's really weird. You know, if there's a harpoon through my chest, I don't think I'd shrug it off so easily, right? Oh, well, this was bound to happen, so I'm just gonna lay down and die. I mean,
well, but if if the naturalistic system is in fact what's going on, you don't have any way to fight against the harpoon in your chest. You are enslaved to the system. You don't have a way out of it. You don't have a way to make claims about things. So you may not like the harpoon in your chest, but a strict naturalist was coming along and say, well, you were bound to not like that harpoon in your chest. You were always going to feel that way about it.
You know what? You're right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
He says, but even if grounds do exist, what exactly have they got to do with the actual occurrence of the belief as a psychological event? If it is an event, it must be caused. Any event in nature must have a cause. It must, in fact, be simply one link in a causal chain which stretches back to the beginning and forward to the end of time. The domino. It's one more domino. How could such a trifle as lack of logical grounds prevent the belief's occurrence? Or how could the existence of grounds promote it? There seems to be only one possible answer. We must say that just as one way in which a mental event causes a subsequent mental event is by association. For example, Lewis says, when I think of parsnips, I think of my first school. So another way in which it can cause it is simply by being a ground for it. For that being a cause and being a proof would coincide. So he's trying to handle all possibilities here. When he's dealing with this cause-effect, ground-consequent problem. He's trying to deal with all possibilities. And one possibility is that he says, we must say that just as in one way in which a mental event causes a subsequent mental event is by association, so another way in which it can cause it is simply by being a ground for it. So this is a possibility he wants to entertain, but he says, but this as it stands is clearly untrue. We know by experience that a thought does not necessarily cause all or even any of the thoughts which logically stand to it as consequence to ground. We should be in a pretty pickle if we could never think this is a glass without drawing all the inferences which could be drawn. It is impossible to draw them all. Quite often we draw none. We must therefore amend our suggested law. One thought can cause another not by being, but by being seen to be a ground for it. If you distrust the sensory metaphor in seen, you may substitute apprehend or grasp or simply known. It makes little difference, for all these words recall us to what thinking really is. Acts of thinking are no doubt events, but they are a very special sort of events. They are about something other than themselves, and can be true or false. This is an important distinction about the kinds of events that are going on in our heads. When a bird eats a worm, this is not an event that's about something. When you think that Mahomes is the best quarterback, that is an event. That thought is an event about something else. And that thought, that event, can be true or false. It's different than the bird eating the worm. The bird eating the worm can't be true or false. It merely is. But your thoughts could be either true or false, because they are about something. Yes, thoughts are events, but they are events about something other than themselves. Events in general are not about anything, Lewis continues, and cannot be true or false. quotation, or excuse me, in parentheses, he says, to say these events or facts are false means, of course, that someone's account of them is false. It's just handling a turn of phrase that we use when we say these events or facts are false. We mean, well, someone's recounting of them, someone's retelling of them is false, not that the events themselves are false. Hence, acts of inference can and must be considered in two different lights. On the one hand, they are subjective events, items in somebody's psychological history. That's what our thoughts are. They're subjective events. On the other hand, they are insights into or knowings of something other than themselves. What from the first point of view is the psychological transition from thought A to thought B, at some particular moment, in some particular mind, is, from the thinker's point of view, a perception of an implication. If A, then B. When we are adopting the psychological point of view, we may use the past tense. B followed A in my thoughts. That's in quotes. But when we assert the implication, we always use the present. Quote, B follows from A, end quote. If it ever follows from, in the logical sense, it does so always. We cannot possibly reject the second point of view as a subjective illusion without discrediting all human knowledge. We can't discredit the possibility that the people actually have genuine insights. Not that they always do, because usually they don't, but that the possibility exists for them to. We can't discredit that without discrediting all human knowledge, without discrediting our very act of trying to discredit. For we can know nothing beyond our own sensations at the moment, unless the act of inference is the real insight that it claims to be. But it can be this only on certain terms. An act of knowledge must be determined, in a sense, solely by what is known. We must know it to be thus, solely because it is thus. That is what knowing means. You may call this a cause and effect because, and call being known a mode of causation if you like, but it is a unique mode. The act of knowing has no doubt various conditions, without which it could not occur. And he lists these conditions: attention, and the states of will and health which this presupposes. But its positive character must be determined by the truth it knows. If it were totally explicable from other sources, it would cease to be knowledge, just as, to use the sensory parallel, the ringing in my ears ceases to be what we mean by hearing if it can be fully explained from causes other than a noise in the outer world, such as, say, the tinnitus produced by a bad cold. So, just as in our football example, if if your assertion about Mahomes was completely, if we could explain it completely in terms of your biases, if we could explain it completely in terms of your prejudices, being that you are a Chiefs fan, this would wholly discredit your claim, right? Nobody would have to listen to you anymore because they would know you to just be, in football terms, a homer. And he gives an example here. When you have a cold, you can hear a ringing in your ears sometimes. But that ringing is not you actually hearing anything, because it's not a sound in the outside world, right? We can't even really call it hearing because nobody else can hear it. It's just you. Right, so that sort of parallels, or that gives us an example, an analogy of how our thinking would be discredited if naturalism were true. If my reasoning and my thinking were merely a product of how the universe happens to work and not a real insight, just as if I was the ringing in my ears was caused by the cold that I happen to have, rather than it actually being an act of hearing, then the ringing in my ears would be discredited, just as my reasoning would be discredited in the system, if nature was a completely interlocked system with nothing being allowed in, because it has a cause. The ringing in my ears has a cause, a cold. My thinking has a cause. The universe happens to work this way. It's not a genuine, in that sense, it couldn't be a genuine insight. He goes on to say, if what seems an act of knowledge is partially explicable from other sources, then the knowing, properly so called, in it is just what they leave over, just what demands for its explanation the thing known, as real hearing is what is left after you have discounted the tinnitus. Anything which professes to explain our reasoning fully without introducing an act of knowing, thus solely determined by what is known, is really a theory that there is no reasoning. That's extremely important there. Anything which professes to explain our reasoning fully without introducing an act of knowing, thus solely determined by what is known, is really a theory that there is no reasoning. If someone is going to come along and say that nature is a completely interlocked system that allows for no independent action, that person is proposing a theory which leaves no room for the act of reasoning that they exercised when they reached that theory. That's extremely important, because understand what someone is doing when they're saying that nature is a completely interlocked system that's ironclad with nothing else being allowed in. They're making an inference. How do they know this? Well, they know it because the evidence that's been presented to them has convinced them of this. Well, isn't that what we've just discredited? We've just discredited that process. We've discredited the process where you're able to take in information and draw an inference, right? Well, if we're discrediting that process, you reached your conclusion that the universe is such and such a system by the very process that we just discredited.
What would you say to a naturalist who said the system of interlocked events allows for us to know that we are in that system and nothing more?
Well, I would say exactly what Lewis is about to say, and that's, well, you're saying the system is locked except for this one thing.
Oh.
You're leaving out, for your own reasoning, you're excluding for your own reasoning this special place that everyone is trying to exclude for their reasoning, but you're saying, I'm the only one that gets to have this moment of insight. I'm the only one, and the only insight that I can have, this is even more absurd, the only insight that I can't have other insights. I can only have this one insight, and that one insight is that there are no such thing as insights.
Huh.
So what you're doing is excluding for yourself a privileged and prejudiced position for your reasoning, but condemning everyone else's reasoning to the Adrian is a Chiefs fan and therefore thinks Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback kind of category. You get to have this moment where you actually have a genuine insight and think something genuinely insightful, but everybody else doesn't. In fact, you also condemn all other thoughts that you've had, all other insights that you've had to that category, just except for this one. Right? You're leaving something out. This is his claim about naturalism. In order for it to be true, all events, including the one going on in your head right now when you're saying that nature is an interlocked series of events, all events must be explicable or explainable in terms of the total system. If it isn't, we've abandoned naturalism. If there's even one event which is outside of that series of dominoes falling, then we've abandoned naturalism as a possibility.
So if you're reasoning, you abandon naturalism.
If you're reasoning and claiming that your reasoning is sound, yes. And that's what you're doing when you say, I've reached a conclusion that nature is such and such a system. You're reasoning because, notice how absurd, or not absurd, but how spectacular a claim, any claim about the universe is. You can't experience nature, you can't experience all of nature all the time because it's massive and you can't be everywhere, right? So any claim that you have about nature, any claim, must be an inference. In fact, our idea of nature at all is an inference. We can't experience nature as a thing. We can't experience it as, just as you can't experience the United States as a thing. It's a concept that is an abstraction. It's built up in your mind, right? Because where is the United States as a thing? We can't go put your hands on it. It's a concept, an idea. Where is nature as a thing? You can perhaps experience the details of nature, but from those details, you infer that there's a larger system that is interlocked and
There's evidence.
consistent. Well, yeah, but it's very scant evidence if you think about it. There's not much of it. I mean, how much of nature can you really experience, even in your whole lifetime, even if you devoted your whole life to experiencing that nature? Very little. You can experience very little of it. Because all you have is your tiny experience on this planet, and even if you read about other people's experiences and you devoted all your waking hours to that, you would still only have a very, very small amount of experience with nature. This system that you've um, established as a concept in your mind. You have to make a huge titanic inference about all of it and think about how big the universe really is. And I say think about that, but that's really an impossible thing to think about because it's so big that we really have no conception of it. I mean, we can hear numbers and try to put those on paper and see pictures from Hubble and try to think about how big the universe is, but it's really lost on us how big it is, and it's lost on anybody, probably even astronomers and astrophysicists, right? It's lost on us. We can't conceptualize it. But the fact that it's that big should tell us that we have a very, very small experience with the totality of it. We have a very minor touch with any of it. We infer from that minor touch something about all of it. It's a huge, huge inference, right? It's I can't call it a belief because when we study it, we find it confirmed. But does that mean that? But then we go from that and say, and thus always confirmed. There's the inference, right? Nature is such and such a system because the evidence that I've seen and condensed, the evidence that other great intelligent people have seen and condensed leads me in that direction, and therefore, here's the inference, it must be true everywhere. These laws must rule everywhere. It's a huge inference because it's an inference about a system that is so much bigger than you that it's impossible to conceive how much bigger it is than you. Now, at the end of this paragraph, Lewis says, anything which professes to explain our reasoning fully without introducing an act of knowing, thus solely determined by what is known, is really a theory that there is no reasoning. He goes on and says, but this, as it seems to me, is what naturalism is bound to do. It offers what professes to be a full account of our mental behavior. But this account, on inspection, leaves no room for the acts of knowing or insight on which the whole value of our thinking as a means to truth depends. It is agreed on all hands that reason, and even sentience, and life itself are latecomers in nature. Sentience meaning a knowledge of yourself, right? This is something that animals seem to lack, a knowledge of themselves. He says, it is agreed on all hands that reason and even sentience and life itself are latecomers to nature. Now, this might, some people might disagree with this, but Lewis is talking about here that there were times in the past, millions of years ago, perhaps billions of years ago, where life didn't exist. There was no life as we define life. There wasn't any. So life is a latecomer to nature. In fact, it's probably very recent if we're looking at it in the scale of years that the universe has been around. It's somewhere around 13 to 14 billion years old. And life has only been around for what, the last billion years or so. That's a very recent, doesn't sound recent to us because we don't live very long, but that's a very recent event in terms of the total time the universe has been around. So it's a latecomer. And so is sentience, knowledge of ourselves. And beyond that, so is reasoning. Reasoning is is much later to the scene than even life itself. So if this is true, he says, if there is nothing but nature, therefore, reason must have come into existence by historical process. It wasn't around at one time, and now it is. It must have come about as a historical process, just as the United States or any country comes about by a historical process. There are events that lead to it, right? And of course, for the naturalist, this process was not designed to produce a mental behavior that can find truth. Because if it was designed to, if this process was designed to produce reason, if it was designed to produce the ability to infer, then nature, we've again abandoned naturalism, because the idea that it was designed at all is a serious problem for the naturalist. So this process, the process by which we came to be able to reason, for the naturalist, can't be a designed process. It has to happen as it has to happen inevitably. It can't be planned from the outset.
Well, what was designed exactly?
The process of nature, the process that resulted in us being able to reason. See, if naturalism is true, the historical process. If naturalism is true, our reasoning had to come about as a consequence of all of the interlocked series of events going back to the beginning of the universe. Okay, it had to come about for that reason, or had to come about by that process. And for the naturalist, this wasn't designed. It was as you put it, it was like dominoes falling on a table. But even that sneaks in the idea of a design, because who put the dominoes there, right? There's a design in the domino pattern. This is it's difficult to talk about the process in a way, even when we bring in, I used the example of a record earlier, an old record playing on a turnstile with grooves in it that the needle is sunk into in the record. This implies a design also, because records and record players don't just assemble themselves, right? So even there's the possibility of a designer. With nature, for the naturalist, even that is gone. Even that designed aspect is gone. Nature is playing out like a rock rolling down a hill. It's
a system of interlocked events. Is there something snuck in there too? I don't know. Someone who turned on the record.
Well,
player.
Right, but the naturalist would say no. That's not that. There is no one who even turned on the record player. Right? There's no lighter of the match for the Big Bang. There's all things in existence came about without a design, without any initiation. So that would include our reasoning, wouldn't it? Because it's one more event inside this process. He says, and of course, for the naturalist, this process was not designed to produce a mental behavior that can find truth. There was no designer with a capital D, and indeed, until there were thinkers, there was no truth or falsehood. Because truth or falsehood is it's a product of minds, isn't it? If there were no thinkers, there would be no truth or falsehood. There would just be events. Planets banging into each other, stars forming, asteroids colliding. These aren't events about which you can say they're true or false. They're just events. What do we mean by true or false? We mean that your account of them, your perception of them, is true or false. So without thinkers, there is no truth or falsehood. Things just are. It's our perception of them or our account of them that makes them either true or false. Right? So there would be no truth or falsehood until there were thinkers. The type of mental behavior we now call rational thinking or inference must therefore have been evolved, which is in quotes, by natural selection. by the gradual weeding out of types less fitted to survive.